Oracle of the Forgotten, the early days of the twin stars. During the time following the birth of the twin stars, things were finally at peace again. The destroyer tried his best to teach his child what he could. At the same time, he was using a special messenger to keep track of his other child. He was still not holding the kind of energy he needed to recover the boy. At some point during the early days of raising the girl, he became close to one of his servants, who returned to his realm with him to assist him with raising the child. Things remained quiet until he began to hear stories of something truly unbelievable. A human man had killed one of the ancient gods in an effort to save his wife from the god's improprieties. The elder wondered if they realized what the mortals were. Still, even he wasn't fully certain of their potential, and had been kept busy with his own matters. His child yet again wandered off into the nearby field of starflowers, and he was constantly worried about her escapes from the shelter of their home. As always, it wasn't long before his trusted servant brought her back to him again. The woman was kind and treated the child as her own. It brought him some peace to know she was watched over, as he was still weaker than he wished to admit. It was the only peace the destroyer could find. He knew his own son was being raised and trained with the idea of being a hand for the council, a guard to enforce their laws and quite likely come hunt his own family someday. Time seemed to pass all too quickly for the elder now. The destroyer hadn't paid too much attention to the outside world. The humans were being tested to see if there was something that allowed this ancient to be killed at their hands. Those with magic were being separated quickly from those who were able to hide it. He knew with this new threat the ancients would try once again to misuse their power. It didn't take long before things moved quickly from just a chance to a firm reality. Outside of the void, the king of humans had been forced into service to the ancients. Any who showed potential to end the life of an immortal was either imprisoned or forced into some level of servitude. Although there were some who resisted, it seemed some even found a sense of pleasure in the work they were given. They were often assigned to end the current incarnation of gods and younger gods. Even if it wasn't usually permanent, it began to shift the entire structure of power. However, there was a mortal who had garnered far more attention than any other, the same mortal who had killed their former master. The others of his kind had made him into their king. The destroyer had to ask his servant how long these mortals live. A couple of thousand cycles of their sun, apparently. Though no one was certain, as most were killed off younger or ended in battle before they reached old age. These facts shouldn't have mattered to a creature like him, yet he developed an odd sense of fascination. He knew he was going to have to look into their history deeper. Still, there was this odd sensation when he thought of them alongside the ancient council. The councils were always a threat as long as they knew his family lived. He just hoped hiding his daughter would make him the only target of their nonsense. Despite his efforts to hide and protect her, his daughter began to grow more and more curious about the worlds. She'd heard about the many races and demanded to learn more. She wanted to learn to fight, to grow, to explore the realms like her only friend does. How do you shelter a curious child? Should you, while her brother was training for war? The former king finally made his choice. He began to teach her combat, to teach her about her own magic. Their early lessons indicated she was going to be quite skilled with both. There was a specific day he planned to take her to her favorite fields of star-shaped flowers, the only time he ever had to cancel his plans as he'd received a message. A mortal had cut past the lines of the realms of darkness and was about to enter the lands closest to theirs. He realized now his hands were tied. He had nearly no time left to do what needed done. He called forward his messenger to look for his child. As usual, she'd gone missing, and this time there was more danger than he liked. It was almost a relief to find that his child had taken up one of her forbidden journeys to the darkest forest, where she often met and played with a youngling of the great scales that had been found wandering the voided parts of the still budding universe. He knew fully that the young dragon would watch over her. After all, they'd somehow become friends. In fact, he knew the youngling creature was in contact with his son, as if some odd twist of fate accidentally connected the two again. He only hoped the creature's travels back and forth would remain unnoticed. So far, nothing could follow him through the void portals well enough to return to their home. His attentions turned back to these mortal warriors. He sent his servant to watch over the child while he laid out his plan. If the ancients thought a mortal could best him, the only choice was to see if that was the truth. He still hadn't recovered his true strength, but a vague whisper from the recesses of his mind was far more foreboding than expected. It's always the ones with nothing to lose. The words of the old king had been silent since the last universe ended. His speaking now was not only out of character, but a sign that he must stay keen to his own surroundings. The old king never spoke without a good reason. If anything, this only added to the destroyer's sense of ill ease. The destroyer gathered his old armor and blade. Despite still having a physical body, he hadn't fully recovered. He was quite certain his friend had not recovered inside of those inanimate objects. If anything, he wasn't certain if it was possible for either of them to fully recover. Such a blatant defiance against the nature of their reality had never truly been tested before. In a sense, it didn't matter. He needed to prepare. He placed a chair beside the fireplace and then pulled a table next to it. Once settled, he leaned his sword against the chair and opened up a book. This book would follow the passage and journey of the two human warriors. If he started back far enough, he might be able to delve into their past. At the moment, their history didn't matter much to him. He turned to the page of their current moments. Time passed the way it does for immortals. It was hard to tell if it was days, weeks, months. In the meantime, the child was being kept track of by her scaled friend, and on occasion her father's servant. The second messenger would also wander back and forth between the realms, now even occasionally trying to talk the male twin into returning with him to the realms of his father. In all that time, the daughter's existence was kept so carefully hidden away. One day the servant met two mortals at the entry of her master's realm, a great portal hidden in the furthest edges of the shadows. She demanded their names and reasons to pass. They said that they had come to put an end to the destroyer, and the woman offered to challenge them. While the man was eager, she'd taken notice of the state of the woman who traveled with him. She was heavily with child, which left the servant entirely uncertain of allowing them to pass at all. The death of a mortal in their realms was bad enough. The child, though, that was an odd situation that would have unpredictable results. She didn't have time to fully investigate the energy surrounding them both. All she could pick up on was blood, the kind that flowed with magic and energy, the kind that was among the forbidden magics. The human accepted her challenge. In fact, the man managed to not only defeat her, one of his strikes had somehow stopped her healing abilities. She was wounded beyond measure and unsure of her own fate. All she knew was that she'd made a commitment, and for whatever reason the human had spared her. It was difficult, requiring much energy for her to continue. Despite her hesitation, loyalty to her master and her agreement with this human drove her forward. She showed them the way to her master's home. In that space, away from all the worlds, in an impossible location, the destroyer waited, casually reading a book when the two came in to challenge him. He hardly glanced up. It seemed to anger the humans who had proven themselves time and again on their passage to him. The elder being remarked that while what they had done was quite impressive, his own kind were not to be trifled with in the same way as the gods. His own arrogance had been earned. Even without the blade of the king, he knew that he could fight. For some reason, this dismissive behavior drove the human into a rage. As he went to strike the destroyer, his blade met nothing but the chair where the elder had once sat. A battle began, tearing apart the room and leaving scars on the living walls that a careful eye could see even in the modern day. The two fought the elder without reservation nor mercy. The elder had returned in kind despite the condition of the woman. That is, until he noticed something. For a brief moment his eyes darted to the energy surrounding her, and he stopped his assault completely. Even the crashing of the human's blade through his right shoulder didn't seem to stir his attention away from what had drawn it. For a moment he paused, assessing his own energy before reaching up and shattering the blade of the mortal with a single blow of his left hand. He didn't care anymore to fight. For all the fire within him, he'd seen something the human hadn't quite noticed. To him, it was far more important than some quarrel started by the ancient gods. He motioned to the woman and then called out for his servant. He knew nothing of how to deliver a human child, but she might. Either way, those words left the previously angry mortal more attentive to his own companion, which the destroyer learned was the man's wife. A king and queen of humans, challenging an elder within his own element. At any other point in history, the idea of any race attempting this would have seemed laughable. But something about the two had honestly impressed him. The humans fought well. They'd done so much damage to his home. When his servant arrived, it was clear to him that she had fought them as well. She was now bandaged, and many of her wounds had been tended to. It nearly brought a smile to his face. She'd always been so loyal. Something about this woman, though. The human concerned him, and he couldn't place it. It was his servant who revealed the truth. The woman had been cast for death, a spell upon her that would end her and the child within should the two not kill the destroyer before the child was born. As the words passed the lips of the servant, the destroyer saw an all too familiar flash in the eyes of the mortal, an all too recognizable rage and emptiness that began to wash over the human. "Then let me kill him." The human spoke out, but was told it was already too late. There was no way to save the both of them, even should the elder die. Rather, the destroyer offered the man an alternative, a chance to live and raise his human child. It was a solution, but not the best one. A human inside of the void? It was almost nonsense. No mortal race had been allowed such a thing, not here. Still, the destroyer couldn't help but feel an odd connection to these two. Maybe it was the twisting of fate in the hands of the ancients. Maybe it was something more. While his servant attempted to save the child, his own energy was depleting again. He had not healed the wound that was now allowing a cascade of deep blue-black flow. The liquid hit the ground, shattering into sparks of light and the occasional shard of crystal. There was nothing to be done. He was no good with things of this sort. Watching them struggle brought nothing but bitter memories. The destroyer took his leave, trusting his servant to deal with the matter at hand. While he was away, he tended to his own wounds. When he had returned, the child rested in the crib that had been designed for his own son. It was a sharp pain, but a brief one. that let him turn his attention to the already grieving father. Perhaps it was a similar wound. The two spent their time learning about each other. They tended to the queen's remains and spent their time working on the care of the boy. Despite some careful planning and his own magic, it was a struggle to keep this stranger from learning about his own living child. While he had brought up the fact that his son had been stolen from him by the councils, he tried to keep her a secret. The servant had built up a space away from their home for herself and the former king's child, a place that he would visit often in the guise of checking on his servant. Still, the little star was always so curious. The crying of the child was often heard from where she had hidden away. The silence of the void breaking was enough to keep her quite curious about this new force in their realms. The fact the woman who was raising her kept leaving only made her more curious. One day she decided to follow the sound. It didn't take her long to realize that it had come from her own home. She was always curious, a bright child who was probably just before her teens, in a sense. The small creature in the cradle was strange to her. It was so full of energy, life, light, and somehow she could almost sense the darkness within him as well. Her eyes were focused on him now. The girl reached out a hand over the cradle, drawing in a little energy that was needed to try and stop him from crying. It wasn't much, just a small spark of colored light. It flickered, flashed, and danced a little before fading into nothing. A trick her scaled friend had taught her, but the small infant seemed distracted by it until the servant took him away again. She was scolded for her presence and asked to go back to their shelter before anyone saw her here. In truth, she knew it was too late. After all, when that child would cry, the father was never far behind. The human king held back. He had not known, even in the time he spent speaking with the destroyer, that the girl actually existed. If anything, to this point he felt the ancients had misled him simply to remove the kings of mankind. She was different from her father. Where he seemed to constantly be shadowed in some swirling void, she shimmered like the sun itself. Strands of color randomly flowed through her white and silver hair. Sometimes the shadows would form upon it like soft waves on the ocean. Her skin was pale as well, reflecting the light of the moons of his own world. The most unusual feature of the child had to be her eyes. Her curiosity drew her to look at the human man before retreating. Her eyes were a mixture of blue and green, swirling about one another like flows of whirlpools where he had first met his wife. They seemed to carry the stars themselves, a brief glimmer of galaxies and entire worlds. Suddenly, he understood what he'd been commanded to do. When the child noticed him, she fled, dashing off to whatever refuge she had been kept hidden in. The human knew what he must do. He went to speak with the destroyer. He told his friend that it was unsafe, that he could not remain here with the child. By now he had earned some trust from the elder, but the mention of the girl was nearly enough for the man to glow with his rage again. It was all the destroyer could do to restrain himself. It became even harder when the human told him next that the ancient council had commanded him to come here, to bring his wife and kill the destroyer, and then return with the child that had been stolen from them. The child he had only now become aware of, the child he knew was sacred to the destroyer as his own children had been to him. By now, the destroyer wanted nothing more than to throw the mortal and the growing infant into the void itself, either back to the realm they came from, or into their death in the absence of space. Still, a pulling within him drew his attention to the boy residing in his own home, a child just like the one he had lost. With a slowed breath, the former king calmed himself. He felt a connection to the human adult, but there was something about this child. He couldn't sense it right now, as if his own indecision has caused the void to swallow the thing from his perception. The destroyer looked at the mortal man. What else was there to do now? His curiosity was starting to match that of the small star. Something about this had a hidden potential that even the elders could not fully see. Maybe if she had her mother's vision, but he couldn't address that right now. He spoke to the mortal one last time before asking him to leave the room. No one was to speak of the girl or acknowledge her existence to the outside world, and he, the human, was never to leave again. To his surprise, the mortal agreed. To the man, all that truly mattered was the life of his own young son. As far as he knew, the other had died before this journey here had even begun. His eldest was stolen, used as a pawn to force them into movement, yet there was no way to know if he even lived. The ancients had been all too fond of killing whatever didn't suit them anymore. The destroyer and the mortal became friends as the children grew stronger. The girl would often sneak in and try to see what she could learn from the strange humans around her. The infant was stranger still to her. With every creature she looked at, she could see threads, webs, and energies. She never mentioned it to her father. She didn't even tell the servant. To her, this was as normal as the ground beneath her feet. As for her father, perhaps the elder had been so lonely with the silence of the old king and the quiet in his own realms. If nothing else, he now had a friend. Having someone whom he could speak with and relate to was starting to grow on the elder, despite his hunger for isolation. He wasn't aware of what his child had seen. There was no way to know if it would change the fates or not. Her unseen visions were the breaking of millions of threads, shattering against an unknown force. The boy had no more ties to fate, being born outside of its reach. Maybe it would have been important to know, but the future of that child isn't quite ready to be revealed yet. For now, there was peace. Like so many good things, it was not meant to last. There was a day while the young human boy was still small that his father was summoned outside the realms of the void. The father of the child was not normally one to defy the destroyer. Whatever lure they had used to draw him out was something beyond the measure of most mortals to resist. By now, the destroyer had felt he could trust this mortal. That was, until the moment he had learned that his own child had gone missing. Had she followed the mortal? Had she wandered in her own curiosity? She often escaped the portal, but then why wasn't the servant with her as well, or the quiet dragon that the elder had often left to guard her? Try as he might, reining in his rage was near impossible. He knew he could have destroyed the infant in the place he rested, yet some part of him couldn't bring harm to the little thing. There was something about him. The threads of fate seemed to unravel around the child. Even the destroyer could not see his future properly. When the human king returned, he was badly injured. The destroyer demanded answers, but was only told he didn't know. The man knew nothing, not who attacked nor where the child was. He only knew that the ancients had demanded he honor his agreements with them. He knew his firstborn was still alive and had proof of it. Somehow, though, the mention of the ancients was enough to send the destroyer into another rage. The thought of what they might do to his daughter. It wasn't long before he found himself with his blade drawn, impaling the man where he stood. As the lifeblood flowed from the mortal, the elder let himself reach into it, drawing the essence from it to find the answers he was now seeking. To his surprise, the mortal didn't fight back. He seemed to somehow accept his end with a grace the immortal was not expecting. No fighting, no tears, no fear, no regret. As if part of the void had entered the man's soul, his blood spoke echoes of it. It called to the elder. Void energy inside this mortal was so new. He knew it hadn't been there at their previous battle. The blood magic of the human, though, was screaming inside the destroyer's mind. The mortal had one single request. He asked the elder to watch his son until he could care for himself. To the surprise of the immortal, he also apologized for not being able to save the girl. As the life drained from the mortal, the former king paused. He stared into the fading eyes of the creature and then let his energy surround this mortal entirely. The last traces of the soul carried so many memories. It was hard to filter it for all the ones he wanted. This race was so young. This one had lived for centuries, one of the earliest of their kind. The visions of his memories were already fading as he finally found the right one. As the child wandered into the fields of flowers, there was silence. She'd likely been there a while when the human returned from his own travels. He'd seen her dancing and singing to herself near the lake. He was confused by her being alone. His eyes scanned the field further and saw something that made his own blood grow cold. Something familiar and very dangerous. An outline. A simple shift in the energies nearby. The human had seen this before. Chameleon-like creatures that would take the form of the land behind them to hide. The only sign of their presence is if there was any movement. This creature had probably waited for her to come. The mortal had thought to walk away, yet some sense of honor in his own friendship with the immortal drew him forward. He drew his blade and rushed after the creature. The winged creature began to fight him, striking him repeatedly. The child turned towards the sound of the commotion. The movements were quick, precise, and the human had been knocked to the side with almost an unnatural ease, even for one of the warriors of the light. Acting like a chameleon, but the appearance of a shadowed angel, but it wasn't either. Nothing about this entity felt like what it appeared to be. The creature had dismissed the human with ease, using its own magic to freeze the mortal's blood and blood magic in place. Even the destroyer did not know what this entity was, only that it had scooped up his daughter using some kind of magic he'd not seen before. The child froze into the very crystals that made up their flesh, only hardened, shining like a statue in the depths of the darkness of the realm of shadows. The stance of the creatures, its wings and shape, it all implied one of the angels. However, the fighting style was nothing like them. A vague recollection from his time bound to the old king only whispered they were eldritch beings from the deep realms and nothing more. The entire being was made out of shadows, a side of strange glowing energy that looked like a tattoo of sorts against its chest. His face was masked in a similar light, allowing him to breathe. It implied the entity was from somewhere that had not had air like the shadow realms do. Even with the words of the old king, it no longer mattered. Whatever this entity was, or whatever name it had, seeing it disable and carry off his child like a trophy was causing him to slowly break from within. The destroyer apologized before asking to know the name of the mortal so he could write it away in the hidden library. That way the name would never be stolen from history. Within the depths of the library are the true names of the father, wife, and son who had been born inside of the shadows. The elder knew that the councils were behind the abduction of his child. For the first time, though, grief actually struck him before rage. Had this human made such a change to a creature like himself? Was it the loss of his own family? He took the mortal's remains and silently returned to his home. Despite the terrible condition of his own servant, he found her attending to the child that was left in their care. She was so wounded from whatever battle she'd endured. Her injuries were far worse than the human, and it seemed to draw out an old sorrow from within the destroyer. Sorrow he could only translate to one thing in his world. He wasn't sure how to address the matter. Instead, he did what he knew he must do. He set the mortal down before walking to her and the child. She confirmed the council's involvement as well. She'd hunted the beast all the way into the trap the council had laid for her master. Despite her wounds, she'd returned to report and to check on the child she'd been so committed to caring for, just as she had been with his own. A short time of silence passed while he gathered his thoughts. Another assault on the council while they were both injured was an impossibility. Still, they'd not yet filled their oaths. While he could use his blade and potentially lose any chance to recover his children, he knew that just once the rage would have to be contained. The throne they had promised to house still sat in the shadows of his realm. He only needed an assistant to help. The former king told his servant to protect the mortal child, carry him to the mortal realms, teach him to fight, and protect him until he was strong enough to be on his own. He told her then to return to his side, as there was so much more work to be done. He knew it would be years before he saw her again, but for now that didn't matter to him. Without another word, he traveled through the essence of the void one more time. He called upon his servant and last remaining friend, the same who had helped him hide his unborn children. He knew if anyone could assist, it would be this man, one of the budding kings of the realms of shadows, a newly risen sin that would rule over the most powerful regions. He was the perfect candidate. The two prepared for the task ahead, but as they did, the destroyer asked his old friend to explain to him what the history of these mortals are and where they came from. After all, they had done what so many had been unable to in ages past. The story that he would be told would be one for the records. He was certain of it.